With its coconuts, castaways, and cartoonish misadventures, Gilligan's Island was meant to be a harmless diversion and a lighthearted comedy. However, something much less benign was taking place behind the synthetic laughter and palm trees. For decades, one of the show's most adored stars remained silent. She played her role flawlessly, waved to loving spectators, and smiled throughout interviews. However, she had knowledge that no one else possessed. And everyone's perspective on everything changed as the truth came to light. The real narrative never finished, even though the cameras stopped filming a long time ago. You won't be able to speak after hearing the revelation that Dawn Wells concealed for decades. I was acutely conscious when they began questioning me about drugs, sex, religion, and interracial marriage. You don't believe your parents are knowledgeable while you're young. Millions of people fell in love with Dawn Wells as soon as she played Mary Ann Summers. Lovely, sensible, and incredibly compassionate. The ideal contrast to the glitzy Ginger was Mary Ann, the girl next door that everyone wanted to be around. However, despite the audience's admiration for her charm, few were aware of the immense suffering Dawn concealed behind her cheery facade. Dawn was still being established in Hollywood when she was cast, in contrast to some of her co-stars who arrived with well-known Broadway characters or significant film credits. Although she was appreciative of the chance, she soon saw that she was not being treated fairly. She was paid much less than other cast members, frequently ignored in news coverage, and marginalized in promotional materials. The network frequently promoted Ginger as the show's face, despite the fact that viewers loved Mary Ann. Dawn never voiced her displeasure in public. She did not perform her part, hit her marks, or smile during any of the interviews over the length of the show. Years later, however, she acknowledged that the lack of attention had weakened her. They never wanted to admit that Mary Ann was the heart of the show, she previously stated in an interview. The glamour was always the main focus. The media's repeated comparisons of her to Tina Louise were even more upsetting. The notion of a rivalry between Mary Ann and Ginger was seized upon by the media, which not only fabricated but also deliberately harmed the story. For years, it followed her, occasionally taking precedence over her real work. The question Mary Ann or Ginger became a joke in popular culture. However, it served as a reminder to Dawn that she would always be viewed as second best, regardless of how hard she worked. Off camera, she frequently felt alone. Being the youngest and very new to the industry, Dawn felt herself withdrawing inward while each of the cast members had their own cliques or routines. She would subsequently claim that she never fully discussed her loneliness. Not even with close friends, but Dawn persisted despite the challenges. She had faith in both her character and the show's power. She was aware of the significance Mary Ann held for the audience, and she was resolved to give it her all, even if it meant sacrificing herself. However, that was only the start. Behind the scenes, the rivalry was much more acrimonious and intimate than anyone understood, despite the media's love of inciting it. The alleged rivalry between Mary Ann and Ginger was more than just journalistic conjecture by the time Gilligan's Island's second season premiered. Even the crew could sense the tension that had grown between Tina Louise and Dawn Wells. Additionally, something much less lighthearted was taking place behind the scenes while fans argued over who was most gorgeous or who dressed better. Tina Louise had clearly shown herself as a serious actor when she first appeared on stage. With experience in feature films and training in the dramatic arts, she felt that her role as movie actress Ginger Grant should have been the main attraction. Tina apparently felt let down when it became apparent that viewers were more drawn to Dawn's friendly demeanor. Cast and crew members claimed that Tina did not like sharing the limelight and that she desired it. In contrast, Dawn was keen to get along. She made multiple attempts to start a conversation and sincerely appreciated Tina's skill and professionalism. However, coldness greeted every attempt. Tina rarely interacted with the other members of the cast, tended to withdraw, and avoided close contact during breaks in the filming process. Sometimes, in order to minimize needless interaction, she would depart the set right away after filming her scenes. The two actresses' differences couldn't have been more pronounced. Dawn was gregarious and always took the time to talk to fans or sign autographs. Tina kept to herself much of the time unless the camera was rolling and was formal and aloof. Even if that dynamic might have succeeded on screen, it fueled rising animosity behind the scenes. Quietly, the other actors took sides. Jim Backus was more impartial, although Bob Denver and Alan Hale Jr. inclined to support Dawn. However, in private, a number of staff members felt that Tina's behavior was creating a rift that was dividing the group. It became into an unwritten norm. If at all possible, keep the two women apart. When questioned directly about Tina Louise years later, Dawn chose to play the victim. "I tried," she said. "Yes, I did. However, there are instances when people don't want to be friends. And even if it hurts, you have to respect that." Although that cold distancing would not be the end of it, the brief, well-chosen remark communicated more than most people knew. In actuality, Tina wasn't the only person Dawn had trouble getting along with, thus their tension quickly escalated into something more. The mood behind the scenes was about to get increasingly worse, and the entire cast hid secrets. The reality on set was far from a tropical paradise, yet the public saw a joyful sitcom with coconut radios and slapstick hilarity. Beyond the laughter and palm fronds, the Gilligan's Island cast was battling ego conflicts, off-camera power struggles, and simmering emotional exhaustion. Dawn Wells and Tina Louise weren't the only ones experiencing tension. It was all over. Even Bob Denver, the creator of the endearing Gilligan, had his limitations and frequently played peacekeeper. He was good friends with Dawn and the skipper, Alan Hale Jr., although he often clashed with producers over script quality and creative control. According to Dawn, Bob occasionally refused to say lines that he felt were badly written, which annoyed the authors but gained him the respect of his co-stars. That was also true off-camera for Alan Hale, who was well known for his loud chuckle and fatherly demeanor on television. A calming influence that made an effort to maintain a relaxed atmosphere when tensions increased. He was one of the few actors who was able to keep a positive rapport with Tina and the rest of the cast. However, his positive energy was insufficient to prevent the situation from escalating. While his portrayal of the affluent and eccentric Thurston Howell III was endearing and humorous, Jim Backus was notorious off-camera for being erratic, particularly when intoxicated. Backus was the true wild card. In private, a few crewmen called him a duplicitous character. Cute and vicious one minute, funny and warm the next. Rumor had it that he played mind games with younger actors, made fun of staff members, and occasionally arrived on set in poor physical shape. Dawn took the brunt of some of such conduct because she was the youngest member of the main cast and was still relatively new to the business. She never openly criticized Jim. However, she once alluded in an interview that some of the players on the set behaved as though they were the owners of the space. And she was obviously not talking about Hale or Denver. Conflicts arose over seemingly insignificant details like the location of the dressing room or the sequence in which credits were billed. There were moments when the stage felt like a minefield. Additionally, Dawn had to continuously navigate emotional landmines, injured egos, and implicit hierarchies despite her professionalism and optimism. The fractures were starting to emerge, and it was more than simply a sitcom, it was a pressure cooker. However, something else was developing even as the cast disintegrated and loyalties changed. A behind-the-scenes personal relationship that almost broke the group up was unknown at the time. Nothing rocked the Gilligan's Island set more than a whispered romance that no one wanted to discuss in public, despite all the conflicts and ego battles that took place behind the scenes. The tabloids never confirmed it. There was never a formal statement issued. However, some with knowledge of the production claimed that something was taking place off camera. Furthermore, it went beyond a basic crush. Early on in the show's existence, rumors began to circulate. Bob Denver was close to Dawn Wells. Very near. They were known to leave the set together multiple times, frequently engaged in private chats in between takes, and shared inside jokes. Some people thought their on-screen chemistry went beyond simple acting. However, the tension behind the scenes increased along with the volume of the whispering. Their friendship was not the issue. It was that Dawn was allegedly the object of affection for another person on set. Later interviews and memoirs had hints that another cast member might have been subtly vying for her attention, even though she never gave names. The waves from this wordless triangle never reached the surface, but were felt by nearly all of the production's participants. Some people handled it better than others, and Dawn subsequently acknowledged that there were crushes on site. Although she was careful not to openly blame anyone, her tone suggested more serious issues. She also disclosed that, particularly in such a close-knit and remote working atmosphere, love problems behind the scenes were more often than fans ever imagined. Later, a former crew member revealed that the second season was a change in tone. In between takes, some cast members ceased speaking. When Dawn connected too intimately with certain individuals, others became envious or possessive. Additionally, insiders said that although Bob Denver usually kept things light on television, there were times when he appeared to be more protective of Dawn than just a friend. Regardless of the facts, it created friction that never went away. Previously intimate relationships became chilly. It started to feel awkward to smile for the cameras. Just out of sight, the light-hearted banter that made the show so popular began to cover up genuine discomfort. Most unexpected of all, Dawn appeared to be caught in the middle. She never promoted drama, never spoke poorly of others, and never behaved improperly. She tried to continue, though, knowing that something was coming. As though nothing was taking place. But the harm was already done. And that undercurrent of anger and jealousy persisted after the show ended. Indeed, it dogged her for years, particularly when the dysfunction shifted from a personal to a financial one due to court cases and betrayals. The cast of Gilligan's Island had no idea that the show would become a pop cultural legend when it was unceremoniously cancelled in 1967. Through syndication, it became a television mainstay that was continuously rerun in American homes. Behind the scenes, however, what ought to have been a triumph swiftly turned into a sour lesson in betrayal in the entertainment industry. And among the hardest hit was Dawn Wells. The majority of the cast received little to no financial benefit from the reruns, despite the show's continued popularity. In actuality, syndication revenues were not covered under the performer's initial contract. Dawn, who had put her all into the part, found it to be a painful discovery. She watched as the show's ongoing success brought her no true financial stability while executives and television networks profited millions. Even worse, decisions were frequently made behind closed doors and not everyone was invited to the table as the Gilligan's Island brand grew through animated spin-offs, reunion specials, and merchandise. Dawn was excluded from a number of early reunion project negotiations, including one special in which she was almost replaced. She put up a fierce fight for inclusion. Even though she eventually retained her position, it was evident that the producers and cast no longer had the same loyalty. There were silent charges of treachery behind the scenes. Backroom arrangements were allegedly arranged by some cast members to obtain greater billing or larger compensation, even at the expense of other cast members. She later said that she was surprised to learn how quickly alliances broke down when money was involved. Finding out that a trusted co-star had cheated on her during contract negotiations to obtain better terms at her expense was one of the most agonizing realizations she had to face. She maintained her charm in public. She didn't lash out or call names. However, if cast connections or royalties were brought up in interviews, there was always a hint of melancholy in her voice. She previously remarked, "Until the business side took over, we were like a family." However, the financial difficulties did not end there. A new era of personal adversity, public scandal, and private struggles that almost shattered her began with the conclusion of Gilligan's Island. Nothing could have prepared Dawn Wells for the difficulties that would arise in her life off-screen, even how awful things had been on set. Dawn Wells would always be merry and to the general public happy, modest, and unendingly hopeful. However, the reality underlying that picture was much more nuanced. Dawn's career slowed drastically after Gilligan's Island. She occasionally appeared on television and in plays, but she never recovered her former level of renown. In private, life turned into a difficult struggle that few ever anticipated. The arrest of Dawn during a routine traffic stop in Idaho in 2007 was one of the most stunning events. According to the police, they discovered items in her vehicle that would indicate narcotics use. For a brief while, Marianne's innocent image appeared to be destroyed when the story made headlines. Dawn, however, denied any misconduct. No drug charges were brought against her when she entered a guilty plea to careless driving and explained that the items belonged to someone else who had borrowed her car. However, the harm to her reputation persisted. Many fans were unaware that this incident was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. Was already facing extreme financial difficulties at the time of the arrest. She worked for decades, but her savings were small. She had been subtly providing for her elderly relatives, and her income became erratic when acting jobs dried up. A close friend started a GoFundMe campaign on Dawn's behalf after it was revealed in 2018 that she was in such terrible financial shape. The objective was to assist in paying for essential living expenditures and medical bills. The fans were taken aback. How could someone so adored? How could a woman whose image had been shown on screens nationwide for decades be dealing with such a crisis? Ever the professional, Dawn was first embarrassed by the campaign, but she finally spoke up after more than $100,000 was donated by friends and fans worldwide. In a rare remark, she expressed gratitude to all of the donors and said the support had humbled and overwhelmed her. It was one of the few occasions she discussed her personal struggles in public. Dawn maintained her elegance despite these difficulties. She kept showing up at fan gatherings to sign autographs and tell tales of her time spent on the island. However, many close to her claimed that the anguish was always present. Health issues, financial strain, and the silent pain of being overlooked by the field she helped create. However, there was one aspect of her life that she remained quite protective of even in her older years. She never told the whole truth. The one that made admirers wonder what Dawn Wells had actually been guarding for so long. Dawn Wells started to open up in her last years, not in huge headlines or candid interviews, but in private, poignant moments. She ultimately revealed how much she had carried over the years through her memoir, appearances at fan conventions, and frank interviews. She did not share that bitterness. It was a deeper need to be recognized as the woman behind Mary Ann, not only as Mary Ann. She talked about how draining it had been to continuously maintain the innocent persona that had followed her for decades. Mary Ann once claimed that people don't want her to get old. They want her barefoot and frozen in time, grinning and making pies. Dawn, however, was elderly. She had experienced financial collapse, emotional betrayal, and grief. She had remained mute throughout it all in order to preserve the dream her followers cherished. There were times when she failed to wear the mask. She made a suggestion in one interview that she would never discuss certain incidents that occurred on set. She didn't want to ruin anyone's legacy, not because she was scared. Everyone has their own truth, she said quietly, and some stories do not need to be told to be understood. Fans often pressed her to speak more openly about her feud with Tina Louise or about rumored mistreatment by certain cast members, but she always demurred. She believed in loyalty, even to people who had not always shown the same courtesy. Her silence, in many ways, said more than any direct accusation ever could, and yet, there was one thing she did make clear. She never regretted playing Mary Ann. Despite all the personal pain, the missed paychecks, the isolation and the tension, she still saw that role as a gift. She once said, "Mary Ann is everything good I wish I was all the time." She gave people hope and maybe she gave me some too. Dawn Wells passed away in 2020 during a time when the world was already grieving so much. Her death made headlines. But what truly stood out was the flood of tributes from fans, fellow actors, and even those she had clashed with. They all said the same thing, that she had been kind, gracious, and deeply loved. But what no one could quite answer was this. What exactly had she kept to herself all those years? What truth did she never say out loud? Maybe we will never know. Maybe the island's biggest secret was not buried in the sand. It was carried in the heart of the woman who played Mary Ann.